Please write down your question. We have a question and answer session later at 5 o'clock. And I would like to give the floor now to Dr. Carool Kersten, is the reader in Islam and Muslim World from King's College, London.
Thank you very much, distinguished guests, esteemed colleagues and conference participants. Today it is 31 years, 10 months and 9 days ago that I graduated from this university. But at that time, I would never have guessed that one day I would climb this roster in the aula of my alma mater to address a conference like this one. Because when I saw the lineup of this event, I was thinking, what have I done to earn a place among those speaking here today? Indeed, it is true that I have had the audacity to write 2 books about Islam in Indonesia. But in spite of that, I do not consider myself an authority on the subject of Indonesia or even Indonesian Islam as such. And that is also the reason why I resist being called an Indonesianist, let alone that I would dare to self-identify as one. My knowledge of things Indonesian are too narrow and too specific for that, but they form part of more wider-ranging interests in Islam and in the Muslim world. I see myself more as a scholar of Islam who deals with the modern history of ideas in the Muslim world at large, so without being confined to a particular geographical area. And I think that has been true ever since I completed my education here in Arabic and Middle Eastern studies with what was then still called a doctoral scriptie on the theory and practices of the Islamic law of treaties. This was at a time when the political use of religion in the Muslim world became increasingly discernible. In the 1980s, proponents of Islamist agendas were still called or referred to as Islamic fundamentalists, and the phenomenon was described as an Islamic resurgence. On closer inspection, however, it would be more accurate to speak of a greater salience of political Islam, because contrary to what observers and political actors thought to be the case, religion had never been really away from the public sphere. Now, while it is indeed true that after attaining independence, post-colonial regimes in many Muslim countries experimented with secular political ideologies, it must also be realized that the 1950s and 1960s were also the decades in which Pakistan was proclaimed officially an Islamic republic. That was in 1956. So more than 2 decades before the Islamic Revolution in Iran. It was also the period when Sayyid Qutb, one of the chief ideologues of Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood, wrote books that continue to be influential to this day. And in Indonesia too. The main Islamic political party, Masyumi, gained its best electoral success in 1955, while outside of the official structures of the Republic, an organization like Darul Islam had violently campaigned for an Islamic state until 1962. Also, in the 1980s, the notion of jihad seemed to get new traction among Muslims, and the misnomer holy war began to gain currency outside the world of Islam too. And it was this development that made me ask the question at the time, if Muslims have indeed coined a jihad doctrine, there must also be another side, a theory of peaceful coexistence. And this gave me the idea to dedicate my master thesis to the Islamic law of treaties and investigate how notions like sulh, hudna, and ahad were theorized and put into practice. Questions of how theories travel or ideas circulate have also informed my later PhD studies at SOAS in which I examined contemporary Muslim intellectuals in their role as scholars of religion. And my interest in the circulation of ideas extends to both the intellectual traffic between Muslims and non-Muslims and within the Muslim world itself. So this then appears to be the red thread running through my scholarly work. And I will try and apply that template also in this lecture, and do this to help set the tone for this conference in which the notion of wasatiyya is going to be explored under its various aspects. Has been noted before, of course, but it doesn't hurt to repeat it again. The root meaning of wasatiyya can be traced to the Quranic notion of ummatan wasatan, the community of the middle mentioned in verse 143 of the second chapter of the Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah. Now, Mufassirs have given different explanations of the meaning of wasat in that context. In classical commentaries, such as Tabari's Tafsir, a connection is made with the idea of justice. Tabari also uses the descriptor Ahl al-Tawassut wa i'tidal, people of moderation and balance. In another commentary, the Jalalain, Ummatan Wasatan is interpreted as an exemplary community. And the modern-day Shiite scholar Allama Tabatabai suggests reading Ummatan Wasatan as a group of people serving as a link, a conduit, or a connection between the Prophet and humankind at large. Now, both in the past and in the present, this has invited debates as to whether that would refer then to Muslims in a generic sense, or whether it must be restricted to those who were first privy to Muhammad's revelations, that is to say, the companions and perhaps the Tabi'un. At the same time, I think it's important to note that notions like a community of the middle or moderation are not uniquely Islamic. The idea of a golden mean is also found in moral philosophies of other civilizations and religious traditions. Think of the Nicomachean ethics of Aristotle, or the mild asceticism preached by the Buddha, and the even more pragmatic ethics of Confucius. Most modern Muslim writings on the subject of wasatiyya continue to link the development to the Quranic notion of ummatan wasatan or tawassut, moderation. But I think that that Arabic nisbah form, wasatiyya, is a relatively recent phenomenon, a neologism even. I also think that in contemporary Islamic thinking it has become an unstable notion. What do I mean by that? It appears that wasatiyya has come to mean different things to different Muslims, turning it conceptually into a bit of a strange beast. Even the quickest survey of its use will show that it is employed by a wide variety of Muslims whose respective outlooks have very little in common with each other. For example, Raymond Baker's book, Islam Without Fear, about what he calls the new Islamists emerging in Egypt in the 1990s, there Baker traces the notion of wasatiyya to a manifesto called A Contemporary Islamic Vision. It was published in 1991 and widely discussed at the 1992 Cairo Book Fair. But the ideas it contains had already been formulated more than a decade earlier. It was a condensation of the ideas of jurists like Kamal Abul Makt, Salim al-Awa, and Tariq Bishri, but also of religious scholars like Muhammad al-Ghazali and Yusuf al-Qaradawi. The Wasatiyya Manifesto provided also theological foundations for the Al-Wasat Party, with which the Muslim Brotherhood took part in the 1996 elections. To my mind, Wasatiyya can also be read as a continuation of the rethinking, or perhaps re-engineering is a more appropriate term in this context, within the Muslim Brotherhood. They often call also the Ikhwan al-Muhandisin. A reassessment of its strategy was already set in motion by its former supreme guide, Hassan al-Hudaybi. And this reorientation took place in the wake of the persecution of the Muslim Brotherhood during the Nasser years, which had led to mass imprisonments and executions, including that of the ideologue Sayyid Qutb. In a book called Preachers, Not Judges, Du'at, La Qudat, Hudaybi refuted Qutb's uncompromising Islamism, in which notions like takfir and jihad dominated. Raymond Baker calls the adherents of this interpretation of Wasatiyya new Islamists, more moderate perhaps than those belonging to older generations, but Islamists nonetheless. And since that time, the advocacy of moderate Islam gained further currency. From the 1990s onwards, this has also occurred on a global scale. And that expansion must be seen in the context of the changing world order taking shape in the post-Cold War era as we moved towards the new millennium. On the one hand, there were the triumphant accounts, like Francis Fukuyama's The End of History. That book was a self-congratulatory celebration in which Fukuyama predicted the victory of free market economics, going hand in hand with the advocacy of worldwide democratization along classical liberal lines. On the other hand, there is the much more menacing picture sketched by Samuel Huntington in The Clash of Civilizations. He singled out the Muslim world as being located on the most dangerous fault lines, threatening the stability and security of a world that is no longer bipolar. Instead, it is divided in civilizational blocks, not determined by political ideologies, but by religiously informed cultural differences. One Muslim response to this doomsday scenario came from an unlikely corner, the Islamic Republic of Iran. In 1999, the reform-minded president Khatami used his address to the General Assembly of the United Nations to plead for a dialogue rather than a clash of civilizations, advocating moderation in order to play down differences. And then 9/11 happened, followed by further atrocities in Istanbul and Madrid, Bali and Jakarta, London, Brussels, the list goes on. So the shift from a clash to a dialogue of civilizations gets another reset. This time in the form of a joint Spanish-Turkish initiative of then Prime Ministers Zapatero and Erdogan for an alliance of civilizations. Replacing both clash and dialogue, the term alliance retains militaristic overtones, and it is symptomatic of a discourse that has dominated since the early 2000s. It is no exaggeration, I think, to speak of a securitization of both political writings and the academic study of Islam and the Muslims. And this then forms the background against which to situate the attempts to explore alternative ways for a continuing role of Islam in public life and for Muslims to get involved as engaged citizens and community members. One remarkable alternative found across the Muslim world is the emergence of Muslim political parties that put less emphasis on the religious aspects of their programs. Instead, they opt for highlighting the generic value of justice, of adl. Adl is also the root word for that other term so closely associated with wasatiyya or tawassut, namely i'tidal, meaning balance, but also temperance. From Morocco to Turkey, and from Egypt to Indonesia, we now find political parties with that term justice in their names, from Turkey's AK Party to Indonesia's PKS. The advocacy of wasatiyya has thus become a key element in finding a way out of the tight spot in which the Muslim world finds itself on the world stage. And it applies all the more to Muslims who find themselves living in communities outside of the historical Dar al-Islam. All over the world, committed Muslims are challenged by a variety of situations, not only amidst fellow Muslims who disavow any political role for religion, they also have to face Islamists who have decided to dig in deeper into their political principles, including some who believe in an uncompromising vindication of violent actions. And in addition, Muslims are also confronted with the Islamophobia on the part of non-Muslims who regard Islam and its adherents with suspicion, if not outright hostility. Now, one consequence of this polarization is that Wasatiyya, or moderate Islam, is now also claimed, I would almost say hijacked, on both the individual and state levels by figures and countries whose backgrounds or histories make it difficult to find them convincing as proponents of moderation. It is laudable that in the twilight of his career, a figure such as Yusuf Qaradawi engages with the notion of citizenship, or muwatana, and shows a more open attitude towards religious plurality, acknowledging the rights of non-Muslims qua citizens in major Muslim countries. But it seems to me that this is rooted in a relatively late realization of the importance of reciprocity when it comes to the rights of Muslims living in a minority situation. It is Qaradawi's experience as the chair of the European Council of Fatwa and Research and its role in the formulation of fiqh al-aqaliyat al-muslima, or Muslim minority fiqh, that acted as an eye-opener. Another instance are the attempts of Saudi Arabia to advocate wasatiyya. This can be traced back to the establishment of the King Abdullah bin Abdulaziz International Center for Interreligious and Intercultural Dialogue in 2012. And more recently, the current heir apparent has begun to position himself as a champion of moderate Islam as well. He has charged one of his protégés, former Justice Minister and now the Secretary General of the Muslim World League, Mohammed Isa, to make the rounds internationally and convene a conference on moderate Islam, which was held in Saudi Arabia last month. With so many different Muslim countries, organizations, and individuals jumping on the bandwagon to lay claim to moderate Islam, wasatiyya is at risk of becoming an empty word. As an example how to avert that danger and safeguard the integrity of the notion of moderate Islam, and to ensure that the term wasatiyya remains meaningful, it's instructive to consider the experiences in Indonesia. I'm going to suggest two things. The first one is that Indonesian interpretations of wasatiyya must be considered in the context of the ways in which Indonesia has defined the role and significance of Islam in post-colonial times. And secondly, that these interpretations are read in conjunction with the adoption of another notion, that of Islam Nusantara. If we take the longue durée perspective of independent Indonesia, then I believe over the last 75 years or so, we can identify some key events and stages that laid sound foundations for a flourishing of wasatiyya thinking in Indonesia as the world's largest Muslim nation state. Much of this must also be attributed to a rather unique phenomenon in Indonesian Islam, namely the kind of Islamic mass organizations that had already emerged during the early decades of the last century in what were then still the Netherlands, East Indies. Muslim leaders were fully aware that the colonial authorities would not tolerate any forms of religious organizations with overt political objectives. And for that reason, Islamic religious leaders decided to focus instead on emancipating the Muslim segments of Indonesian society through education and da'wah. Both the Muhammadiyah and the NU concentrate on schooling and other ways of religious instruction to rally and unite Muslims around sets of Islamic values that also had the potential of influencing politics through indirect means. A similar mindset also guided the political leaders who took charge after the Declaration of Independence in 1945. The first post-colonial leaders acknowledged that Indonesia was a majority Muslim country. But they did not give in to the demands by Islamist politicians to include the Piagam Jakarta, or the Jakarta Charter, in the preamble to the first constitution. Instead, the Pancasila, or the doctrine of 5 principles, was introduced as a quasi-state ideology. In contrast to the Jakarta Charter, the Pancasila's first principle does not refer to Islamic law, but keeps Islam at arm's length of state institutions and of the political process. It only requires Indonesian citizens to confess to believing in a single supreme being, Ketuhanan Yang Maha Esa. For a multi-ethnic and multi-religious country like Indonesia, such a principle avoids religion becoming a divisive issue in society and a potentially explosive political problem, threatening the unity of the country. It makes Indonesia into a religious country, but not an Islamic state. And in independent Indonesia, such positions have been reiterated time and again. For example, think back to the late 1960s and the early 70s, the time of the Gerakan Pembaruan Pemikiran Islam, the renewal of Islamic thinking movement of student activists associated with HMI. Recall in particular the slogan introduced by HMI chairman Nurholis Majid, Islam yes, Islamic parties no. Another crucial period for preparing the ground for Wasatiyya thinking in Indonesia was the decade from 1983 till 1993. On the one hand, the New Order regime introduced the explicit reaffirmation of Pancasila as the Asas Tunggal. This meant that all social actors, including Islamic mass organizations such as the ANU, had to reiterate their allegiance to Pancasila. For the ANU, this was an incentive to recalibrate its activities. And with the benefit of hindsight, it can be said that the decision to return to the origins of its foundation, Kembali Kita 26, gave leaders like Gus Dur the moral authority to become de facto opposition leaders. On the other hand, between 1983 and 1993, Indonesian Muslims were also able to live out their religious devotion and spiritual inclinations through the so-called reactualisasi agenda, introduced and facilitated by the then Minister of Religious Affairs, Munawar Shadzali. By the mid-1990s, Indonesia was unmistakably much more visible and openly present in Indonesia's society than in the decades before. All this created the seedbed for what happened with the regime change of 1999, when the leaders of the 2 largest Islamic mass organizations occupied the 2 highest offices in the land. The ANU's executive chairman Gus Dur becoming president, and Muhammadiyah leader Amin Rais becoming the Speaker of the Consultative Assembly. But that success must be attributed to their personal integrity, certainly not to the advocacy of an overt political role for Islam, because in the parliamentary elections, Islamic parties did not do all that well. The vast majority of Muslims voted for established secular parties, PDIP and Golkar, and they have continued to do so. The next defining moment in shaping Indonesian Wasatiyya thinking is the year 2005-2006. This is what I consider a watershed year in post-Suharto Indonesia. Why is this particular year so important? I have learned from political scientists specializing in democratic change that about 7 or 8 years into the process, democratization moves from the initial transition phase into the consolidation phase. It is this transformation that puts the robustness of a democratization process to the test. One important indicator of the resilience of a democratic system is namely its ability and its confidence to give room to voices that do not share the values underlying that system. And that is why, after the regime change, room was given to political parties with Islamist agendas. Even vigilante organizations like Laskar Jihad and FPI were tolerated. But in 2005, the challenge came from a different corner. The Indonesian Council of Religious Scholars, or MUI, a body that was already established under new order and which holds quasi-official status. In the summer of 2005, MUI issued a series of fatwas that were reason for real concern. In one fatwa, MUI took a negative stance towards collective prayers in the context of interfaith encounters. In another one, MUI effectively forbid Ahmadis to worship and give voice to their beliefs. It was fatwa number 7 that put some of the most important achievements of the regime change and of reformatie in jeopardy. Concepts like secularism, pluralism, and liberalism were considered un-Islamic. Such a position flies in the face of the values underlying the Pancasila doctrine. It is also at odds with universal human rights standards, including the freedom of belief, conviction, and expression. Opponents of the positions taken by MUI in these fatwas responded a year later with the so-called Maklumat ke-Indonesiaan. It was a statement inspired by Pancasila principles, affirming the notions of plurality, freedom, and toleration as Indonesian values. It heralded a polarization between what I do not hesitate to call reactionary and progressive Muslims, pitching vigilante organizations such as the FPI against Muslim intellectuals from both NU and Muhammadiyah backgrounds who want to uphold universal human rights standards and liberal political values. A central role in these debates is played by young NU cadres promoting an interpretation of Islam they called Islamic post-traditionalism, abbreviated to the Indonesian acronym POSTRA. The ideas of POSTRA have an interesting intellectual pedigree. They are very much inspired by the thought of the Moroccan philosopher Mohammed Abd al-Jabri. When his writings were first translated into Indonesian, they were published in a booklet with the title Post-Traditionalisme Islam. The translator of these texts was one of these young NU cadres, Ahmed Basso, and he has explained how he was introduced to al-Jabri's ideas by Kang Said Akil Siraj. The counter-narrative that opposes the MUI fatwas has also been formulated by human rights activists associated with the Wahid Institute, in particular Ahmed Soedi and Rumadi, who incidentally also has written one of the most detailed studies of Islamic post-traditionalism. Rumadi explains that there need to be no contradiction between, on the one hand, modern liberal values, religious plurality and toleration, and on the other hand, the traditional of Islam of the NU, with its commitment to Shafi'i fiqh, Ash'ari theology, and the moderate Sufism of Al-Ghazali. For the next decade, from 2005 until 2015, Indonesian society polarized between these opposing positions on matters of religion. And it is in this charged climate that Muslim religious scholars and other intellectuals have been deliberating alternatives to bridge the widening gap between hardline Islamic exclusivists and religious pluralists in order to diffuse the growing tensions that threaten Indonesian society. It involves senior NU ulama like Mustafa Bisri, who plays a key role in promoting the twin notions of wasatiyya and i'tidal. Najib Burhani, a young academic who himself is associated with the Muhammadiyah, has conducted very informative research into the ways in which the NU emphasizes that tawassut i'tidal nexus and how it is further strengthened by these other concepts, tawazun and tasamuh, equilibrium and toleration. Now that I have mentioned the Muhammadiyya yet again, I should make a brief aside and note that in this reformist Islamic mass organization you can find a counterpart to the NU's progressive postra, namely the network of young Muhammadiyya intellectuals, Jaringan Intelektual Muhammadiyya Muda, or JIM for short. Just as the postra cadres are mentored by senior figures like Said Akil-Siraj and Masdar Masoudi, JIM received patronage from former Muhammadiyya chairman Ahmed Shafi'i Ma'arif and professors Amin Abdullah and Munir Mulkan of the State Islamic University Sunan Kalijaga in Yogyakarta. These progressive-minded Muhammadiyya intellectuals have also shown to be open to culturally sensitive interpretations of Islam. Their acceptance of Islam cultural resonates with the idea of Islam Nusantara promoted by the NU. If 2005 and 2006 was a watershed year, giving reason for pessimism about the future of religious freedom in Indonesia, the year 2015-16 may be considered another turning point, giving some ground for cautious optimism. I want to single out two events that shows a renewed assertiveness on the part of Muslims who want to oppose reactionary interpretations of Islam that can lead to regressive politics, endangering the further development of the democratization process in Indonesia. The first event is the publication of two books in the summer of 2015. Both were launched at the annual congresses of the Muhammadiyya and the NU respectively. Both were written by young intellectuals from these two Islamic mass organizations. The Muhammadiyya's publication was entitled Fiqh Kebinekaan, and this is clearly a wordplay on Indonesia's national slogan, promoting diversity, plurality, and toleration. The NU book was called Islam Nusantara and promoted the significance of interpretations of religion that are embedded in a cultural context. Within a year, the concept of Islam Nusantara had also been adopted by the NU's senior leadership. The International Summit of Moderate Islamic Leaders, ISOMIL, held in Jakarta in May 2016, was used to introduce Islam Nusantara to a world audience through what the NU called the Jakarta Declaration. In his address to ISOMIL, Kang Said reiterated what other observers have said about the role of Islam in the context of Indonesia's political institutions and its society at large. That Indonesia is not an Islamic state, but a country capable of accommodating religion. Indonesia bukan negara agama, tetapi Indonesia adalah negara beragama. NU leaders were also careful to note that Islam Nusantara is not an export commodity to be copied elsewhere in the Muslim world. Beyond Indonesia, its purpose is to stimulate and encourage Muslims to develop their own culturally sensitive interpretations of Islam. On a global level, Islam Nusantara is instructive in demonstrating that a culturally embedded interpretation of religion goes hand in hand with moderation, with Wasatiyya thinking. Earlier, I gave the example of Yusuf al-Qaradawi as an instance of a reactionary Muslim who changed his mind. I believe there are also figures within the NU who have made similar turnabouts. I will mention no names, you can fill those in yourself. And time will tell how genuine their change of mind has been. I will end with repeating the earlier observation that Muslims may have different ideas about what Wasatiyya means. And indeed, this does raise the uncomfortable question to what extent the term Wasatiyya is useful. But isn't that exactly what you're trying to find out with this conference? Therefore, I wish you success. Thank you very much for listening. Terima kasih banyak.